Welcome back to Behind the Scenes of the Waltons as I continue my conversation with Michael O'Keefe from The Competition and The Elopement. Please welcome back, Michael. Well, how did I'm guessing just because that you had no idea they were going to bring the character back.
Not clueless.
So how was that when you got that call?
I was mind blown. I got the phone. They were like, "We want to read your character," and of course, back then we never really talked about recurring characters, and I don't think it was the first time a guest actor was ever brought back again. But to my experience of being in the business, I'd never heard of it. Mm. So I thought, "Oh, wow, this is cool! I get to go back and revisit this," and Mary Elizabeth was so great, like as a scene partner and kind of, I really, I felt like we related well to each other. And I really, I really liked working with Ralph and Michael. And I remember the scene where we eloped and it wasn't going too well afterwards. And they had to come get her and bring her back home, and I spun a web. My character had spun a web of beauty and allure and an adventure to come and marry me. And then, of course, it got real right away and it wasn't going to work out and she had to go back home. And there was this moment where I was trying to convince her it was all going to be okay. And then Ralph bursts in the door to the room we were in. And I remember I turned around and was like, oh, no, he's going to kill me. And my friends and I, when we watched that moment, we all laughed because I hadn't really planned anything, but I just about jumped out the window when he walked in the door of the room. And so all of those little things as actors that we find that make it real or make it come to life, that was one of those jobs that gave me a great deal of confidence and a great deal of really, kind of necessary belief in myself to keep going because in the end, you really, you have to kind of find a way to keep going on your own because you're the one that makes it happen, really.
Yeah. And we were so lucky with the writers that we had and the way that Earl guided the show. Because when I saw that scene that you're talking about, where you're at the Justice of the Peace and mid ceremony, Aaron's like, I can't do this. And you two step into the other room to talk. And that it wasn't what you would expect all the time. Like if I'd seen that, or it'd be, okay, well, what's going to happen is you're going to go in there and you're going to try and talk her into it or whatever. And that wasn't what you were doing. It was all sort of, I understand. And it was very caring and nurturing. So you didn't feel like the character of Chad was in any way trying to push her or talk her into something she wasn't comfortable with, which I really loved. So it kept your character very likable in it, like he got caught up in it too, and it was very disappointing, but you never made her feel bad about that experience. And then when John and Olivia come in, same thing, you would have expected John to just, grab you by the scruff of the neck or punch you or whatever, but that again, they saw what was going on and that he just kind of put his hand on your shoulder and went, come on, son, like you recognized that he understood in that moment that you were both young and had dreams and they didn't work out, but he didn't berate you. And I just thought that was lovely that it wasn't what I would have expected it as an audience watching most shows.
Well, that's, I'm actually really curious about what it was like for you to work with the writers because, like I said, I kind of had a little bit of that in Roseanne, and back then I didn't really even understand the concept of like there was a writer's room somewhere with 4 or 5 or 6 other writers that were working with Mr. Hamner to kind of bring the story together, and then would have breakout guys over here doing this or that.
No, that wasn't how our show worked. We were a little before that. And although Earl was originally, the story editor and the creator, but we didn't have a writer's room. The scripts were farmed out to whoever, the producers, and I'm sure Earl had a lot of input in that, whoever was sort of on the approved list from the network and from the company. And so at the beginning of a season, we would get the breakdown of episodes for the whole year. And most of them were titled, but some of them weren't. And most of them had writers next to them. Some said, basically to be determined. And so I don't know. I think it was a mix of maybe some ideas and most of our producers were also writers. But they wrote some episodes, but not always. And I think the rewrites happened more internally, but the scripts weren't all created in-house. So those would come in, and then we didn't, as the younger cast, they did have table reads with just the adults. Michael, Ralph, Ellen, Will, and Richard would do a table read. I think one time they brought all of us, and they just decided that was like way too much to deal with. Plus we had to do school and stuff. So they only would bring the adults in. And then they would, and Michael has talked about this, how much she and Ralph, and probably Richard too, because he had really good sensibility, how much they would fight for the integrity of the show and to keep the quality and the theme and the reality of it. And once it kind of came down to set level, we had very little opportunity to do much change within there. So, I wouldn't say that I ever felt particularly listened to relative to the writers. I was just grateful that by the time it got to me, most of the time you could find a way to make it work as an actor. But sometimes things seemed contradictory and I objected, but I didn't have a lot to say, so I did it.
Right. Yeah. I don't know what it was like for you as a teenager, but like I said, I never really even understood what producers did, and I was so naive about it that first year in LA. That year that I did your show, I think it was that year or the next, I did my first feature film with Charlton Heston, which was a submarine movie. And this submarine sinks in peacetime and they have to go and rescue everybody. And it was that movie, and it was the Mirish brothers had produced it, and they had just done, Earthquake or a couple of other disaster movies, Poseidon, and that was their thing. They were like doing these disaster movies because they were working. And I was on the set, and I had this kind of moment. I was talking to one of the other actors, and this is, one of those sort of moments that are born of, only the brilliant arrogance of a 19-year-old on a movie set who thinks he knows more than he actually does. But I turned to one of the actors and I was like, what do the producers even do, man? What do they do, really? Because what are they doing over there in those chairs just judging us? We're the artists. I was clueless. I was absolutely clueless about the way television got made and movies got made. And, of course, the producers are the ones that set everybody up to do that. Mm-hmm. So that you can stand in front of a camera and do what you want to do, or you can stand behind a camera and tell the DP you'd like to see a dolly shot, move across the floor this way. The producers make all of that happen. But back then, I really didn't know. And it was not, I wouldn't say trial by fire, but I did so much of my learning as an actor on the job. It was probably like that for you too, in a way, right?
Certainly for some, like Mary had never, before the Homecoming, that was her first job, her first audition, I think. And same thing with Cammie, because she was so young, she was 6 years old when we did the Homecoming. So it was her first job also. So for some of them, that was the case. For me, I started doing theater when I was like a kid. I did children's theater, and then I worked with the theater repertory company when I was like 10 or 11 for 2 or 3 years. And I'd done, a little television here and there. So I'd been on sets enough to have a familiarity from the perspective of being an actor, but everything else, but so much of it, was we all learned. We learned together, and Ellen Corby would help advise at times, and us, she'd kind of make recommendations, and Cammie said she really helped her because she sat next to her at that kitchen table. So, and Ellen had been a script supervisor, so she was very attentive to the, you will have to match. So don't be doing that. And you need to do this. And, so.
I didn't know that. So she had been a script supervisor before.
Yeah. Back in sort of the early days, I think she worked on The Little Rascals or something and as a script supervisor. And yeah. So we certainly had wonderful people to learn from. And yeah, I think, and we were too young to have gone to film school or, whatever. So it was just learning on the job.
Well, there were some acting programs back then. I know Yale had its program and Juilliard was up and running because I have contemporaries that came out of those schools back then. But there was a different kind of thing that happened for me in New York as a young actor, which was that, and you probably had this happen too, by the time I was 18, I still looked like I could play a lot younger than that, even though I was quite tall. And so that became an incentive for people to hire me because they knew I didn't have to be in school. So I ended up working a lot and not really training as much as I could have or should have. And I ended up, as an actor, really going back later and doing more training in my 30s. And then even I worked with a coach through my 40s and 50s until she passed away, Penny Allen, just because I always had a sense that I wanted, as a younger actor, that kind of isolated time would have been really valuable to me, where I was just in school, just learning, just trying things out, and then deal with all the pressure of the professional aspect of being hired to do the job. But it didn't work that way for me. I just started like you, by the time I was 12, I was doing commercials. By the time I was 15, I did a pilot. I was going to my auditions by myself in the city. I was commuting into New York. And, so I kind of just found my way into it that way. But, yeah. And I know I keep going back to this, but the fact that I landed on your show, it was really, really special.
Thank you. I'm always I hear that a lot, and it's really nice to hear from people who came in to guest that, now somebody who didn't have a good experience might not share that information or might say, might stay away from any of the reunions or things, but universally that seems to be the case. And I think we always tried to make people feel welcome. And because we had such a bonding of our own and felt so much like a family, it was kind of like, oh, we have guests and, yay, who's coming to play with us this week? And so I think we always enjoyed welcoming people. And I think we've talked a little bit about this sometimes as a cast, that I think our casting directors and the producers, when they were doing the auditioning, I think they had a really good sense of the individuals that they cast, that it wasn't strictly, I'm sure whoever fit the role the best played a huge part, but I think they also somehow innately brought personalities to the table that fit our vibe. So everybody always seemed to just kind of come in and slot in seamlessly. And, there was a certain magic to it that you can't really put a formula to.
I had a conversation with Stanley Donen one night, the great film director who directed Singing in the Rain. And we ended up at a party together in New York. And all of a sudden I was alone on a couch with Stanley Donen. And so I started gushing, about how great his films were and how much I admired them. And, he said, thank you. And then he really made it clear that his job, he felt, was to put the right person in the right position so that everything that was supposed to happen would happen. And then he could just be there to kind of like watch it go on. And, the selflessness of that really struck me, but also the insight he had that he knew he needed the right director of photography to capture whatever Gene Kelly was doing. And he needed the right art director to put the background behind American in Paris to look like that was going to look what it was going to look like. And all of those decisions that he just kind of sort of said, oh, yeah, I put right people in the right job. Well, that was his job. That's what he did so well. And that's what it sounds like those guys at the Waltons did for you, is that they just put everybody in the right position. And then it sort of happened because, you know this as well as anyone. Nobody really knows what's going to make a show a hit until it's on the air and people find it and go for it. And there's plenty of brilliant filmmakers and producers that have thought they had the hit of their lives on their hands. And, 2 weeks after they finished shooting the first episode, it was all over and that was that. So there is some kind of magic that takes place. But like we were talking earlier about it being about relationships, I think that's really the biggest part of it is putting the right person in the right place to create that whole world. And The Waltons is, one of those shows. It's indelibly etched in my memory and in the memories of so many, not just Americans, but really worldwide TV watchers that, it sort of sets the bar really in a way. It's a real standard maker. There was so much magic on your show. I'm also reminded of John playing guitar, and what a wonderful musician he is, and how kind of natural it all seemed for him to like pick up a guitar and just start laying down some great chop or something like that. And everybody just kind of appreciate. And I remember being on the set and being like, he could be a recording star. He could go out on the road tomorrow and have a band and play gigs. And he was as good as anybody out there, but there he was on your show.
Yeah. He did that after he went out on tour as a lead guitarist.
Yeah, he was that good.
Recording sessions and stuff. Yeah,
well, that's the magic of your show, whoever put all those people in the place that they put them in, all those actors and all those designers and writers and everybody, that's the magic making, and it's things like that you kind of live for and you work towards capturing things like that. And you guys did it, and you did it year after year.
Thank you for joining me for the continuation of my conversation with Michael O'Keefe. I will be back with more with Michael very soon. Thanks for watching.